Okay, so when you picture a courthouse in your mind,
Hmm.
it's probably, those grand marble columns, and it just feels like
Yeah.
timeless tradition, right?
A very heavy feeling.
Yeah. But underneath all that, what we're seeing now is a pretty huge tech revolution
Yeah.
that's going on. That's really changing how legal systems in both the United States and Canada
Right.
actually work.
Absolutely.
So today we're diving deep into something you might not expect,
Yeah.
artificial intelligence, and how it's being integrated into our courts.
It's fascinating to think about, this isn't something that's
Right.
way off in the future. This is happening now.
Yeah.
AI is being used in courts today, and it's affecting everybody from massive corporations who are
Yeah.
dealing with complex regulations to just individuals who need to understand
Rights.
what their rights are, what their obligations are.
Yeah.
It's happening now, and it's really changing the face of justice.
Yeah. And that's what we're here to do today.
Yeah.
We've gone through a ton of information.
Yeah.
And we've pulled out what we think are the most important pieces for you
Absolutely.
to understand how this is all working.
Yeah.
So let's start with something called predictive justice.
Okay.
It's kind of like a weather forecast, but for the legal system.
That's a great way to put it. So essentially, you've got AI looking at huge amounts of past legal data, like think thousands and thousands of old cases,
Right.
to try and figure out what's going to happen in new cases.
Mm-hmm.
The basic idea is that there are patterns in all that data, right?
Yeah.
And the AI can see these patterns that humans might miss, and that gives lawyers and judges a sense of what might happen in a similar situation.
And we're already seeing this in action in the U.S., right?
We are.
There are platforms like Lex Machina and Ravel Law.
Mm-hmm.
So what these do is they give insight into a judge's past decisions.
Right.
So, for example, if Judge Thompson, let's say, has a history of siding with a certain type of argument in contract cases, these platforms can show that. And that's going to help legal teams figure out, how to present their own arguments.
Exactly. It allows lawyers to prepare their cases using a ton of data
Yeah.
to make the strongest arguments for their clients.
And this is happening in Canada too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It is. One company that stands out is Blue Jay Legal.
Okay.
They're based in Toronto, and they're focusing on areas like tax law and employment law.
Hmm.
And they're claiming some pretty high accuracy rates in their predictions, like over 90%.
Over 90%.
I know. It's pretty amazing.
That's huge.
It really makes you think about what it means when legal outcomes become that predictable, right?
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, how does that change the whole process?
Right.
If you have a tool that can say, okay, this is probably going to happen,
Yeah.
how does that affect how lawyers prepare their cases
Right.
and how they advise their clients? Should we go to trial or should we just settle?
It definitely adds a whole other layer of strategy
You-
to the whole legal process, right? If the data's telling you you're probably going to lose,
Right.
then maybe settling is the smarter option. And, it's interesting to think about how this kind of predictive power could change.
Mm-hmm.
How we as individuals think about legal problems.
Yeah.
Or how do you prepare yourself if you know
Okay.
what the likely outcome is going to be?
Yeah, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about another way AI is being used.
Okay.
And this one might be a bit more controversial.
Yeah.
It's in criminal justice with risk assessment tools.
This is a big one because it really gets into issues of freedom and liberty.
Yeah.
These AI tools are trying to predict
Yeah.
how likely someone is to commit another crime.
Right.
A well-known example in the U.S. is Compass.
Mm.
And what Compass does is it looks at all sorts of factors about a person.
Right.
Everything from their past criminal record to their social and economic situation. And it comes up with a risk score. And judges in some places actually use these scores when they're making decisions about bail,
Yeah.
or how long someone's sentence should be, or even whether to grant parole.
Okay, so it's like trying to use data
Yeah.
to make those really difficult decisions. But
Exactly.
I read that Canada is being a little more cautious about this.
Yeah, Canada's definitely taking a more measured approach here.
Yeah.
So, for example, Ontario's been testing out risk assessment for bail decisions,
Okay.
but they're really emphasizing that the AI score is just one factor.
Right.
For the judge to consider, it's not supposed to replace the judge's own judgment.
So the human element is still really important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a key difference between the U.S. and Canada,
Yeah.
in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
These AI tools are sometimes having a really big influence on what judges decide.
Right.
But in Canada, there's more hesitation to let an algorithm
Yeah.
make those kinds of life-changing decisions for people.
It makes you wonder, where do we draw the line?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
When algorithms start to have power over things like someone's freedom, It's definitely something to think about.
So moving on, AI is also changing the way courts handle all the documents and paperwork.
Oh, yeah, this is huge.
It's not as flashy as some of the other stuff we've talked about, but it's incredibly important.
Absolutely. You know, think about it.
Yeah.
Any legal case involves mountains of text, like case law and statutes and old rulings and contracts, and
It's overwhelming.
it's a lot. And AI is amazing at processing all that information.
Right.
It can scan through millions of pages in a tiny fraction of the time it would take a person.
It's like having a superpowered research assistant.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this is actually being used right now.
It is.
So the Canadian Federal Court, for example, they're using AI to manage all their immigration and refugee cases.
Oh.
So it's helping them sort through everything,
Right.
prioritize things, and make sure the right cases are getting attention.
Yeah.
And in the U.S., federal courts are using AI to handle things like habeas corpus petitions. So these are real-world applications that are making the system run more efficiently.
And for businesses, this is especially important in something called the discovery process, which is basically where you have to go through tons and tons of documents to find the information that's relevant to a case.
Right.
And AI can do that way faster and probably more thoroughly than a person ever could.
Which saves businesses a lot of money.
Exactly.
So let's talk about that bigger picture for businesses.
Okay.
How is AI changing the bottom line for companies that are dealing with legal issues?
Well, one of the biggest impacts is cost savings. Automating tasks like document review and legal research can really cut down on expenses.
Right.
Like you mentioned that Canadian Bar Association study
Yeah.
that found that businesses using AI were saving an average of 60%
60%.
on their discovery costs.
That's huge.
It's significant, and it's not just in Canada. U.S. companies are reporting big savings, too,
Yeah.
in areas like analyzing contracts and making sure they're complying with regulations.
It seems like this could make things a little more fair, right?
Yeah.
Because now smaller businesses that don't have massive legal teams can still get access to
Exactly.
sophisticated tools.
Levels the playing field a bit.
Yeah. But there are also some new challenges for businesses to think about with AI,
There are, for sure.
especially when it comes to compliance.
Right.
So now companies have to worry about not just how humans are going to interpret the law, but how an algorithm might interpret their actions.
Yes, exactly.
And that's a whole new way of thinking for a lot of business leaders.
It is, and it's especially important in industries that are already heavily regulated,
Right.
you know, like finance or healthcare. As AI monitoring systems get more sophisticated,
Right.
they're going to get better at finding potential problems, whether it's, you know, securities violations or antitrust issues.
So businesses really have to understand how these tools work to make sure they're staying on the right side of the law.
Absolutely.
And then there's the whole issue of litigation strategy,
Right.
you know, trying to decide whether to fight a case in court or try
Right.
to settle.
Exactly. So if you have AI that can give you a pretty good idea of what's going to happen,
Right.
it changes how you think about those decisions.
Yeah.
Smart businesses are using these AI predictions to help them manage risk. We're seeing this a lot in Canada, especially in corporate legal departments in places like Toronto,
Yeah.
you know, where understanding potential legal problems is super important.
So it's becoming part of how businesses make decisions.
It is.
Okay. So you've mentioned a few times that Canada has been a little more cautious
Yeah.
than the U.S.
Yeah.
in terms of adopting AI in the courts. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think Canada has been more focused on making sure that technology helps human judgment rather than replacing it.
Right.
The Canadian Judicial Council has these guidelines that emphasize that technology should be there to support judges,
Yeah.
not to take over their role. And there's a real emphasis on making sure that the legal process is fair for everyone and that people's rights are protected.
Yeah.
So it's more about finding that balance between innovation and the core values of the justice system.
And different provinces are taking different approaches, too.
They are, yeah.
So British Columbia, for example, they've been pretty innovative with their civil resolution tribunal.
Yeah, BC is a good example of how AI can make the legal system more accessible to people. So their civil resolution tribunal is all online.
Right.
And it uses an expert system to help people resolve disputes without necessarily needing a lawyer.
Okay.
So it handles things like small claims and property disputes. And it's designed to be really user-friendly so that people can understand their rights and options and even work through the process themselves.
So it makes it less intimidating for everyday people
Exactly.
to deal with legal issues.
And they've had a lot of success with it.
Yeah.
You know, Thousands of cases have been resolved through the tribunal, and people seem to be pretty happy with how it works.
Whereas Ontario seems to be more focused on using AI to address those huge backlogs.
Yeah, that's right.
In the courts,
Yeah.
especially in areas like family court,
Mm-hmm.
where delays can be really stressful for people.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
So Ontario's looking at AI as a way to speed things up
Okay.
and make sure that cases are resolved more quickly.
So different priorities.
Different approaches.
And then you've got Alberta,
Mm-hmm.
which has been using AI in complex commercial cases
Okay.
to help with document review, but they're very careful about it.
Mm-hmm.
The judges are always involved
Right.
to make sure that the AI is being used properly.
So it's like a cautious experimentation.
Yeah, exactly.
And let's not forget that Canada has a really vibrant legal tech sector.
Oh, yeah.
With companies like Cura Systems, which is now part of Litera.
Mm-hmm.
They're really leaders in AI-powered contract analysis.
They are.
So it seems like Canada's trying to find that sweet spot, right?
I think so. Where they can embrace the benefits of AI,
Mm-hmm.
but also make sure that things like transparency and fairness
Right.
are protected.
It's about finding a way forward that works for everyone.
So let's dive into a few specific examples
Okay.
of AI in action in North American courts.
Yeah, let's do it.
You mentioned the Compass system earlier. Can you give us an example of
Sure.
how it's been used and some of the issues that have come up around it?
Yeah, so one case that got a lot of attention involved a guy in Wisconsin
Okay.
who was up for parole.
Mm-hmm.
And the parole board used his Compass risk assessment score
Mm-hmm.
as part of their decision to deny him parole.
Okay.
And this case really raised questions about how transparent these algorithms are.
Right.
The guy who was denied parole argued that he didn't even understand how the algorithm came up with its score.
Yeah.
And that it wasn't fair to use it against him.
So it's like a black box.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
It's this tool that's making these important decisions.
Yeah.
But people don't always understand how it works.
Yeah. And what happened in that case?
Well, the Wisconsin Supreme Court eventually said it was okay to use Compass,
Right.
but they also warned about its limitations and said that judges need to be careful about how much weight they give to the algorithm's score.
So it's a tricky balance.
It is
Yeah.
trying to find that balance between efficiency and fairness.
Yeah. Okay. So let's look at a more positive example.
Sure.
You mentioned British Columbia's Civil Resolution Tribunal earlier.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit more about how that actually works for people?
So imagine you have a dispute with someone.
Okay.
Maybe it's a small claims issue or a disagreement with your landlord.
Mm-hmm.
You can go to the tribunal's website and use their Solution Explorer,
Okay.
which is basically like a step-by-step guide
Mm-hmm.
that helps you figure out your options.
Yeah.
So it asks you questions about your situation,
Mm-hmm.
explains your rights, and even helps you write letters and documents.
Yeah.
And if you can't reach an agreement with the other person,
Mm-hmm.
the tribunal can make a decision for you.
Okay.
And the whole process is designed to be really easy to use.
So it's empowering people
Yeah, exactly.
to take care of their own legal issues.
And it's saving them a lot of time and money.
Yeah.
Because they don't necessarily need to hire a lawyer.
That's great.
Yeah, it's a good example of how AI can be used to make the justice system more accessible.
So we've talked about AI helping with decisions.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about AI helping with document review.
Right.
What about just the day-to-day running of the courts?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any examples of AI being used to make things run more smoothly?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So in Ontario, they have this bail optimization project,
Okay.
and it uses AI to predict how long different bail hearings are going to take.
Okay.
So this isn't about whether someone should get bail or not.
Right.
It's about scheduling,
Mm.
making sure that the courts are using their time and resources as efficiently as possible. So the AI looks at all sorts of factors about a case, and it gives an estimate of how long the hearing will probably last.
Mm.
And this helps the court staff schedule things better,
Yeah.
make sure that judges and lawyers aren't sitting around waiting,
Right.
and it can actually help reduce the amount of time people spend in custody.
So it's a behind-the-scenes improvement
Yeah.
that makes the whole system run better.
It's about improving efficiency without
Wow.
interfering with the actual legal decisions.
So looking ahead, what are some of the things you're keeping an eye on in the future of AI in law?
Well, one of the biggest areas is natural language processing, or NLP.
Okay.
It's basically how AI understands and processes human language.
Mm-hmm.
So as NLP gets better, we might start seeing systems where people can talk to the courts
Wow.
in plain language.
Yeah.
Imagine having a chatbot
Mm-hmm.
that can answer your basic legal questions
Yeah.
or guide you through a process without you needing a lawyer.
That would be huge.
It would, and there's also a lot of interest in using blockchain technology to manage evidence securely, which is really important these days with so much digital evidence. Blockchain can help make sure that evidence is authentic and hasn't been tampered with.
And what about virtual courts?
Oh, yeah, virtual courts are here to stay.
Right.
And AI can help make them run more smoothly. You know, things like AI assistants that can manage schedules and documents and even provide real-time translation.
Wow. That would make things much more accessible for people.
It would.
Yeah.
And there's even some talk about using AI to analyze people's emotions during virtual testimony, like looking at facial expressions and vocal patterns to try and figure out if someone's being truthful.
That sounds a little bit...
I know it's controversial.
Yeah.
There are a lot of ethical and scientific questions about that, but it's definitely something that people are looking into.
So what about regulations? Are there any rules or guidelines being developed for how AI can be used in the courts?
Yeah, both the U.S. and Canada are starting to think about this. So in the U.S., organizations like NIST are working on developing standards for AI systems. And there's a lot of discussion about needing more laws and regulations to make sure that AI is used responsibly and ethically. In Canada, there's a proposed law called the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, which would require more transparency when AI is used for things that have a big impact on people's lives. So that definitely includes the courts.
So it seems like we're moving towards having some guardrails in place.
I think so, which is important, you know, as these technologies become more powerful.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to touch on the idea of human-AI partnership. You mentioned that earlier, and it seems like that's really the key to getting this right.
I think so, too. You know, AI is great at certain things. It can process tons of data. It can spot patterns. But humans are still better at other things, like understanding context and using judgment and empathy. So the best scenario is where AI and humans work together. AI can provide information and insights, but ultimately humans are still making the decisions.
It's about combining the strengths of both.
Exactly.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, what are some of the key takeaways they should keep in mind?
Well, I think it's important for businesses to realize that their legal data is becoming more and more important. You know, they need to think about how that data might be analyzed by AI, both by their own lawyers and by the courts. And they need to be aware that the use of AI in the courts varies from place to place. So what works in one jurisdiction might not work in another.
So do your research.
Exactly. And I think it's also smart for businesses to start thinking about using predictive analytics themselves to help them anticipate legal problems and manage risk.
So be proactive.
Yes.
And what about for individuals?
Well, I think it's important for everyone to be aware that AI might be used in their case, whether it's for something like document review or scheduling, or even for something more impactful like a risk assessment. So don't be afraid to ask your lawyer about it. You know, find out if AI is being used and how it might affect your case. And if you're dealing with a civil matter, like a small claims issue, it might be worth looking into AI-powered dispute resolution services, which can often be faster and cheaper than going to court.
So it's all about being informed.
Exactly. The more you know about how AI is being used in the legal system, the better prepared you'll be.
It's clear that AI is changing the legal landscape in a big way.
It really is.
And it's happening now. So we need to pay attention.
Absolutely.
And figure out how to navigate these new realities.
And it raises some really big questions.
It does.
You know, about how we balance the efficiency and the data-driven insights of AI with the importance of human judgment and fairness in our legal systems. It's a challenge, but it's one we need to face head on.
And I think that leads us to a final thought for our listeners.
Okay.
As algorithms become more and more common in our courts, how does that change our understanding of what justice means?
That's the big question. You know, as we rely more and more on technology to make decisions that affect people's lives. What does that mean for the human element of justice? Are there things that humans are uniquely qualified to do that algorithms can never replicate? That's something for all of us to think about as we move into this increasingly digital future.
Food for thought.
Yeah.
I hope so. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into AI in the courts.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.